Good afternoon to our Flagstaff and broader community. We are excited to join you today for another Lived Black Experience session. This community dialogue has expanded from initial conversations about Juneteenth to broader conversations about what is the Lived Black experience of folks living in Flagstaff in Northern Arizona, and has now moved beyond even that into a broader conversation of what is the lived Black experience in America, and why is it important for us to talk about this today. Today, we're going to be focusing on America's first president, General George Washington, looking at his role as a founding father, looking at who he was and where he came from. We'll be examining his role as a husband and a father, and also as a slave owner, and also discussing in part his will of 1799 and his changing beliefs regarding slavery, and contextualizing all of that into the ongoing story of the lived Black experience in America. It is my pleasure to introduce you to our speaker today, who is Dr. Michael Green. Michael Green is an associate professor of history at UNLV's Department of History. He earned his BA and MA at UNLV and his Ph.D. at Columbia University. He teaches history courses on 19th century America and on Nevada and Las Vegas for the History Department and the Honors College. His books on the Civil War era are Freedom, Union, and Power, Lincoln and His Party During the Civil War, Politics in America in Crisis, The Coming of the Civil War, and Lincoln and the Election of 1860. His works on Nevada include Las Vegas, A Centennial History, Nevada, A Journey of Discovery, a middle school textbook, and the oral history of a longtime Nevada attorney and politician, a liberal conscience, Ralph Denton, Nevadan. The University of Nevada Press published his college-level textbook, Nevada, A History of the Silver State, in 2015. Welcome, Dr. Green. I will turn over the conversation to you.
Thank you very much, and I'm trusting everybody here is okay. And I am a return presenter. It's nice to be back. I was here last time talking about Lincoln and emancipation, and I was asked to talk today about George Washington. And at first, I was a little uncertain. I'm still uncertain, because when you think of the founding fathers and the issue of slavery, Jefferson comes first. And I know there was recently a presentation on him. The guy on the left side of the screen has us talking about Alexander Hamilton and slavery. Well, George Washington is the father of our country, according to lore and legend. And where was he in all of this? Generally, we know he had Mount Vernon. There must have been enslaved people there. What else is there to the story? So we're going to take a look at that today and have some time for questions too. And yes, I am wearing my George Washington socks. If I contorted myself enough to be able to join a circus, I could show you. Anyway, I did want to say my usual line about George Washington, the thing on the right. How did that boat not sink with all of those people on it? Okay, let's go to the next slide. We're going to talk about getting right with Washington. There was a Pulitzer Prize winning historian of the Civil War era, David Donald, who wrote an article about getting right with Lincoln. And he talked about how generations since the Civil War, especially in politics, have tried to tie themselves to Lincoln in one way or another, including those who claim to have been surprised to find out he was a Republican. Well, we don't see quite the same with Washington, but the portrait on the right, which was done after Lincoln's assassination, suggests these two are really, for lack of a better term, our secular saints. They are the people we have tended most to look up to historically, if we were to pick leaders who fit traditional descriptions of leaders, political figures, generals, and so on. Obviously, a lot of other leaders deserve attention and get more of it. And as you can see on the list on the left, we are going to try to talk about Washington as a person, as a general, as one of the founding fathers, as the president, as one who enslaved others, and then, yes, a question mark about emancipator, although we can say he kind of was, sort of. So let's go to the next slide. And I have put in the upper left a book written by a historian more than 40 years ago about the image of Robert E. Lee. And they called him the Marble Man because there were so many statues and there was so much in the way of what I guess we could call legend about Lee that we had a lot of trouble getting to know the real person and his faults. There's a lot of that with George Washington. We really have more trouble getting into his faults, I think, because we do hold him on a pedestal, or traditionally have, in ways that other leaders in our past have not been held. So we often think of him as this stern, determined, possibly humorless guy who had integrity and an image for it. And we don't think of him as one of the intellectuals the way we did with, say, Jefferson, Madison, Hamilton, or Adams. He was actually more interesting than we might think. He was born on February 11, 1731, under the Julian calendar. And about 20 years later, England changed to the Gregorian calendar, and New Year's and all that began differently. So his birthday changed to February 22nd, 1732, meaning he got a year younger. And I think most of us would love to aim for that. Washington pulled it off. His family had arrived in colonial Virginia in 1656 and made most of its early money from land speculation, and he followed in the footsteps of his ancestors. He was very much into land speculation and land itself. Washington's father died when young George was 11. That would have been about 7 years probably after he did not chop down the cherry tree. That became one of the great legends about Washington, of course. But when George turned 11 and his father died, George inherited his land and, technically, the enslaved people on it. Washington's brothers went to school in England. They went to fine private schools. George did not. He learned pretty much what he needed to know of math to become a good land surveyor, and he could write. He was not elegant in the way we think of some others in our past, but he could make himself clear. And he wasn't funny either in the way that Lincoln was. He did well in his work. He ultimately inherited Mount Vernon from his older half-brother Lawrence and Lawrence's widow in 1761. He also was actually a bit of a playboy in his own right. He loved to dance. He would dance all kinds of events and enjoyed himself doing it. And we don't think of that guy on Mount Rushmore or on the quarter or on the dollar bill quite that way. He married Martha Custis, a widow, in 1759, and they had a happy marriage. The rumors persisted that his great love was actually a woman named Sally Fairfax. Now, that's not necessarily so, and he and Martha had an apparently very happy and loving marriage. I will note for the record that years ago, when on TV, there was a mini-series about Washington. Patty Duke, a great actress, played Martha. A fine actress, Jacqueline Smith, played Sally. Jacqueline Smith was one of Charlie's angels, and I think they were trying to hint a little more strongly. In any case, he managed the estates he inherited and the land Martha had inherited when she became a widow. And it's important to bear in mind, Martha's husband died without a will. The result was that she inherited control of his estate, but as a woman, faced different property laws than men did. And she wound up technically owning 1/3 of the estate, with the rest going to the children. And she could manage it for the children, or when she remarried, George could. But that meant that she came with what we call a dowry of her own enslaved people and land. George also was a politician early in life. He served for 7 years in the the colonial legislatures, the Virginia House of Burgesses. And I want to tell you how much things have changed over the years in politics. The answer is it hasn't. In his papers, there is an invoice for one of his campaigns for payment for a barrel of whiskey placed at a polling place, a dipper, had to pay for the dipper, and a sign saying compliments of George Washington, candidate for Virginia House of Burgesses. So the next time you hear that the Founding Fathers weren't politicians like the others, don't buy it. Let's go to our next slide. We're going to talk about Washington, the military man. And like most of the young men of his time, he served in colonial militia. In what became known as the French and Indian War, he was involved in one of the key early battles, which he lost and managed to sign the surrender document to the French. And it turned out that he gave up more than he should have because the translation wasn't done properly. Now, his battles were fought out in western Pennsylvania, of all places, if you think about it, not too far from Virginia, starting in 1754. The war began here and became a world war in Europe as well, and was called the 7 Years' War because it was fought for 7 years. They did not start the war saying, oh, by the way, the war is 7 years long, we'll quit in 7 years. He was not too thrilled with British officials. He was second in command to a colonel named Edward Braddock, who would not listen to him, and Braddock ended up being killed, and Washington had to take command and basically concede. The battle was being lost, but in the process, he redeemed himself for whatever questions there had been about the earlier loss. In the course of fighting, his uniform ended up with several bullet holes in it, and he had 2 horses shot out from under him. He demonstrated considerable bravery, and therefore he was respected again, but the British never quite respected the colonial militiamen. They had not come up through the British Army. Washington wanted a commission from the British and didn't get it and was upset about that. What is important from this is that he got to spend a lot of time studying the British Army and learned a lot about their tactics, which would serve him well during the American Revolution. And the portrait in the lower left is of him around the time of the Revolution, as is the portrait at the top. Now, I think we know the basics of that story, but in 1775, the Continental Congress created the Continental Army and named Washington to command it. Now, Washington had the tendency, as most did at the time, to claim he really didn't want to have to leave Mount Vernon and do these things. The truth is, he showed up at the Continental Congress wearing his old uniform to show he was a military man. And John Adams nominated him to be the commander because Massachusetts had been getting all the attention, and Adams realized we need Virginia and other southern colonies to be on our side, and this will help. So Washington takes command in 1775, and he doesn't win a lot of battles. He did a lot of retreating. Now, the British Army was considered the greatest in the world at the time, whether or not it really was. In addition, the militias are just coming together, and they're not necessarily very good at battle or with their aim and other things, so they lose a few. He won some big ones. He won the Battle of Trenton, Christmas 1776. The British had mercenaries from what is now Germany, and they were there unhappy, drunk, being away from home for Christmas, and Washington realized this and attacked them and won the battle. And it was helpful not only militarily, but to morale that the colonists had won one. He sent reinforcements to the Battle of Saratoga. He was not the commander there, but when the newly minted United States of America won that battle in 1777, it helped Benjamin Franklin negotiate the alliance with the French. At the same time, Congress was under pressure to replace Washington with the winning general at Saratoga, Horatio Gates, who really had nothing to do with the victory. He just got lucky. Washington did indeed locate the army at Valley Forge, which didn't go well. But his approach to the British was pretty much to wear them down, and he did. And despite long odds, he kept his army together. They often weren't being paid. They weren't well disciplined. He commanded their respect, and he was tough on them when he needed to be in the ways that we would, I suppose, expect the military to have that kind of approach. Well, at Yorktown, with help from the French Navy, he defeats Lord Cornwallis. The band plays The World Turned Upside Down. It's the final major battle of the Revolution, and the result will be the Treaty of Paris in 1783, which gives the United States the independence it had claimed in the first place, though even then, the British took advantage of their strength to take advantage of the new United States. And when the war ended, Washington resigned and went home to Mount Vernon. His men talked about having him march on the Capitol to get their money, and he diffused talk of any such action. And all of this led to a comparison to the statue you see at the bottom of your screen, Cincinnatus, a Roman general who was done fighting and retired to his farm. There was an emergency in Rome. They called him up and named him the dictator so that he could defeat the enemy. He went to Rome, won all the battles in 2 weeks, and then said, all right, now I'm quitting and going back to my farm. And this kind of established the idea of a Roman republic. Likewise, this is helping to establish the idea of the United States as a republic where the military is subordinate to the civilians. Let's go to the next slide. So whenever I look at this portrait, I think it's a John Trumbull portrait of the Constitutional Convention, and I see Washington there, I always think he must have had a bad back because he's standing so straight. And if you look at the center of the portrait, it's Hamilton and Franklin. And I shudder to think what those two roustabouts were talking about. Well, Washington was one of the reasons for the Constitutional Convention. The Articles of Confederation required unanimity to accomplish just about anything. And there was a dispute between Maryland and Virginia over their boundary and the Potomac River. And the Articles of Confederation Congress couldn't settle it. So he hosted a meeting at Mount Vernon in 1785 to do that. And the delegates said, you know, things are not working. Maybe we should get more people together and talk. And then there was a meeting in Annapolis in 1786, and he didn't go to that. But the delegates there said, let's all get together. Let's ask the Confederation Congress to let us work on the articles and figure out what's wrong with them and make some suggestions. Well, Washington wasn't thrilled with this idea. He didn't really want to leave home, but he did, and he went on up to Philadelphia in the summer, actually in this case, late spring of 1787. They get there, they go into Independence Hall, they close the doors, they close the windows, they draw the shades, look at one another and say, this thing isn't working, let's rewrite it. So Washington presides over what has been called a convention of demigods. And I mean, you've got Madison, Hamilton, Franklin. One of the most underrated people at the convention was James Wilson, a Philadelphia attorney. Washington manages to keep all of those egos in check because he is so well regarded, and he presides very well. In addition, the second article of the Constitution they write relates to the executive branch, and there is no doubt that when they were writing it, and Madison is one of the main people involved with this, of course, they're thinking of Washington as the president. So in a sense, he's overseeing the writing of the article that he is expected then to execute as the executive branch's leader. And the idea was a president who was commander-in-chief of the military, whose powers were limited in some ways, more open in others, but with checks and balances to keep him from going too far, whatever too far might be. It's worth noting he is the only person unanimously elected president, and I think he's going to stay that way. Let's go to the next slide. So there was an editor at the New York Times who once ordered the staff never to use the term unprecedented to describe anything a president did, because he said nothing has been unprecedented since George Washington. And there's some truth to that. He has to build the executive branch. In doing so, he has to work with Congress, and he's allowed to have a cabinet, and he appoints some cabinet members. What we find is something that a couple of historians, one of whom was one of my old professors, Stanley Elkins and Eric McKittrick, called in a book called The Age of Federalism, an extended encounter with firstness. Everything was new, which helped guide how these people reacted to one another. So Washington has become president. He starts appointing cabinet members. He chooses Thomas Jefferson, who had been the minister to France, as his Secretary of State. He chooses Alexander Hamilton, his one-time assistant, and a prominent attorney with good Wall Street connections, not to mention a great singer and writer of musicals, as his Secretary of Treasury. There are others in the cabinet, but they are going to be the ones who wind up at loggerheads. And there is going to be plenty of fights between them. And Washington kind of has to be the referee. And it's pretty clear as we look back on it that he leaned toward what Hamilton figured to support. So in this case, domestic issues. The upper left is the First Bank of the United States. Hamilton had a financial plan, and Washington ended up supporting it. But Hamilton's plan included a federal bank that would help keep the economy under control, taking over the debts of the states, and Jefferson opposed it. Well, they negotiated, and if you're familiar with the musical, yes, this is pretty realistic. In the room where it happened, Jefferson, Madison, and Hamilton agree. Hamilton gets his financial plan, and the nation's capital would move from New York first to Philadelphia. It was already in Philadelphia when they met, actually, and then on to Washington, District of Columbia. And Jefferson oversaw the design of our capital city. Ultimately, Jefferson and Hamilton differ over a lot of domestic issues. They read the Constitution differently. Jefferson believes in a strict construction that leaves more power to the states. Hamilton in a broader construction that allows for a stronger federal government. Jefferson believes in a more powerful Congress, Hamilton in a more powerful executive. We also see disputes about international issues. And in the upper right, that is a portrayal of the French Revolution. And yes, that is someone holding someone's head out over the crowd with the guillotine behind him. France had been America's ally in the Revolution. And when the French revolted against Louis XVI in 1789, most Americans were very pleased. They seemed to be following in our footsteps. But that revolution became more radical. And some of the leaders were demanding American help, especially after France and England went to war. Hamilton argued, unlike Jefferson, who really did want the U.S. involved, for neutrality. We couldn't afford to be involved, and Washington agreed. Washington also supported Jay's Treaty, which was a negotiation with England that, frankly, involved all kinds of things that England should have been doing under the Treaty of Paris and hadn't. Well, this was not a wildly popular treaty, to be honest, but it did pass, and Washington put his weight behind it. There was also a domestic matter, the Whiskey Rebellion, when farmers in western Pennsylvania would not pay their taxes, and Washington led the army to enforce the idea that you're supposed to pay your taxes. No IRS yet to take care of that. Well, after 2 terms, Washington decided it was time to go home again, to go back to Mount Vernon, and issued a farewell address that Hamilton did most of the writing on, though it was Washington's ideas. And it was meant to signify that power in a republic passes from one to another. And this is a gift from Washington, in a sense, that he did not try to remain in office, granting that he undoubtedly could have. He also didn't want to. The presidency was exhausting even then. It's far more exhausting now. But back then, Washington, by 1796, was 64 years old, which was well beyond the life expectancy of that time, which we tend to forget. And he decided, I'm going. And his farewell address said that we should avoid partisan politics where possible. It didn't quite work out that well. And avoid entangling alliances with foreign countries. We haven't always listened on that either. And to be fair about it, sometimes the partisanship has been a good idea, and sometimes the entangling alliances have been a good idea. Let's go to our next slide. Okay, we need to look at Washington in the context of his time and in the context of him being an enslaver. In doing this, I want to mention a very important work of history. And by the way, I see that Kara has posted both The Room Where It Happens, which is my favorite song in Hamilton, next, along with Burn. I really like that song. And One Last Time, and it's really good. And by the way, when I got to see it here in Las Vegas, where I live, it was funny that the actor playing Washington was about Hamilton's height. And while many other people were discussing the fact that it was, of course, a multiracial cast, and bless them for doing that, I was saying my only problem was that Hamilton and Washington were eye to eye, and Washington was about 5 inches taller. Anyway, the story of Washington and slavery. Edmund Morgan was a historian for many years who wrote a book called American Slavery, American Freedom, The Ordeal of Colonial Virginia. And he called it the American Paradox, that people who advocated freedom in the American Revolution and talked about freedom both before and after enslaved people. And that was the paradox. And where that paradox also comes in is that slavery made the founding fathers from enslaved areas possible. George Washington did not have to go out and pick his own tobacco. And he did not have to hire people to pick the tobacco. Thomas Jefferson was the same way. And this meant that they had a degree of freedom because of slavery that we find in retrospect reprehensible. But this was their time, and this is who they were. Well, Washington became what we would call an enslaver of 10 people at age 11 with his inheritance from his father, and the dower from Martha Custis added 84 more. Purchase and childbirth led to still others. Now, Martha's husband, Daniel Parke Custis, actually claimed 285 enslaved persons, but remember the rule with the lack of a will, so 1/3 are hers, and the other 2/3 belong to her children. Now, Washington kind of went back and forth in certain ways on slavery. It's kind of a strange story. He began to feel that slavery as an institution was not that profitable, especially when the soil was exhausted from the tobacco and he switched to growing grains and realized he needed fewer enslaved people at Mount Vernon. He wasn't making as much money as he had been because of this change. By the Revolution, he publicly attacked the international slave trade, but he also attacked the proclamation by Lord Dunmore, a British leader, offering freedom to the enslaved who chose to fight on behalf of the British. During the Revolution, he refused to sell any of his enslaved people because he felt it was wrong to break up families. He'd done that in the past, and he decided he should not do that in the future. He ended up supporting the enlistment of free blacks in the Revolutionary Army, and his army was actually more integrated than any American wartime army until Vietnam. If you think of Glory, the movie about the Civil War, Massachusetts 54th, it's a segregated unit. When black people were in the military, they were segregated. During the Revolution, there was much less segregation. After the Revolution, he demanded that the British abide by the provisions of the treaty that ended the war, which included returning any enslaved people who had escaped. He also opposed abolition, which northern states were gradually doing. But he also said privately, and when I say privately, very privately, that he really thought they needed to find a way to get rid of slavery legislatively. And he would continue to say that as president. He thought it should be done gradually and not with immediatism, as they would say, where suddenly all of the enslaved people were freed. It may be that exposure to Hamilton, to John Laurens, and to the Marquis de Lafayette, all of whom were either opposed to slavery or, as in Hamilton's case, queasy about it, may have led Washington in that direction. Now, as the presiding officer at the Constitutional Convention, he doesn't necessarily determine that much of what's in the document, but we know that there is a very pro-slavery side to the U.S. Constitution, and there are anti-slavery provisions. So, again, with Washington, it's not necessarily consistent any more than we see consistency on the part of other founding fathers. As president, he opposed the Haitian Revolution led by Toussaint Louverture, the rebellion in San Domingo. He also did what Congress wanted him to do. Congress passed the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793, the first such fugitive slave law, and he enforced it. He also signed laws that continued the Northwest Ordinance's ban on the spread of slavery in the old Northwest territories, Michigan, Wisconsin, and so on. And he opposed American involvement in the international slave trade. So again, not all one way or the other in terms of policy. Now, on the left side of the screen, you're seeing what were the quarters of the enslaved people at Mount Vernon. His approach was paternalistic, for lack of a better term, in that he felt responsibility for the people at Mount Vernon, no matter who they were. He expected them to work hard. He did too, though. They worked 6 days a week. They had Sundays and holidays off. When they were sick, he provided medical care, including, in the case of one ailing enslaved person, having that person moved into the house at Mount Vernon where he lived so that that slave could get better medical care. He recognized the marriages of his enslaved people, even when legally he did not have to do so. He provided for basic needs, but he wasn't generous by any means. The standard rations went to them. They didn't get fed any more than necessary, things like cornmeal, salted fish, but they also kept gardens on their own, and they could eat or sell the food they grew in their spare time. His overseers did inflict whippings. Washington said it should be used only as a last resort, and that he would review all such cases when the overseer felt a whipping was called for. There are reports that he occasionally chewed out or took a swing at enslaved people, and obviously they could not strike back for fear of death. It's also worth noting, when you look at Washington, you may not think this, he had a very loud temper. Jefferson once said of him, of his temper, when it broke its bonds, he was most tremendous in his wrath. And one time he was mad at one of his subordinates, General Charles Lee, and the description was he swore at him till the leaves shook on the trees. We know he spent his life trying to control that temper. But it's also clear that the enslaved people of Mount Vernon were a lot less thrilled with the lives they were leading than Washington might have thought. He noticed that productivity decreased significantly when he was away. They worked as much and as hard as they had to. He thought at times the medical care was really unnecessary. He had the feeling that they might not have really been sick. And the fact is, based on the evidence, sometimes they weren't. They used what opportunities they could to cost him some money and avoid having to do the backbreaking labor he required of them. An estimated 47 enslaved persons escaped from Mount Vernon during the nearly 40 years it was under Washington's control, and that's a significant percentage. Now, the most famous escapee from slavery, in terms of Washington, is depicted on the right of your screen, Oni Judge, a maid to Martha Washington. Her mother was an enslaved mulatto at Mount Vernon, and her father was a white tailor who was an indentured servant. She was born around 1773, and when she was about 10, she began living in Mount Vernon as a playmate and servant for Martha's granddaughter, And as she got older, she became Martha's body servant. When the Washingtons went to Pennsylvania, she went with them. Now, Pennsylvania was in the process of eliminating slavery, so you might think, well, does she become free when she goes there? There had been a ruling in England in 1772, the Somerset case, in which the Lord Chief Justice of Great Britain ruled that slavery could not exist in England. It could exist in the colonies with positive law, but if you brought your enslaved person to England, that person was free. And this was something that the Founding Fathers noticed and did not like. Well, in the United States, there had been no law yet that really said that was the case. Really, it would not be settled until the case of Prigg v. Pennsylvania in 1842. And we know later the Dred Scott decision and what that entailed. Well, Oney Judge was not too happy still to be enslaved in free territory. And then Martha told her that her granddaughter Elizabeth was getting married and Oney Judge would be her wedding present. And Ms. Judge felt, no. And so she knew some free blacks in the Philadelphia area. And the Washingtons were about to leave Pennsylvania, not much happening in the federal government, and go home to Virginia. And they were caught up in packing, and anyone who's been packing for a trip knows no matter how much help you have, it can be quite an ordeal. And when they weren't looking, she took off. They were able to put her on a ship to New Hampshire, which prompted Washington to have placed in the press the ad that is on the screen, what we would have called a fugitive slave ad requesting her return. Someone in New Hampshire recognized her, having been in Philadelphia and having been around the Washingtons. And when he learned of this, he wanted her returned. She replied that she would come back if Washington guaranteed her freedom after he and Martha died. In addition, when Washington said, send her back, his friend in New Hampshire said, no, there will be a riot here if you do that. The people here do not like slavery. Well, when Washington learned of this, he sent a letter where he said, I regret that the attempt you made to restore the girl, Oney Judge as she called herself while with us, and who without the least provocation absconded from her mistress, should have been attended with so little success. To enter into such a compromise with her as she suggested to you is totally inadmissible for reasons that must strike at first view. For however well disposed I might be to a gradual abolition, or even to an entire emancipation of that description of people, if the latter was in itself practicable at this moment, it would neither be politic or just to reward unfaithfulness with a premature preference of freedom, and thereby discontent beforehand the minds of all her fellow servants who by their steady attachments are far more deserving than herself of favor. And you can read that a lot of ways. Well, later, Washington had a nephew who visited New Hampshire who had a plan to arrange for her to return. And then he decided when she wouldn't go along, he'd kidnap her. And then he apparently had a drink or two one evening, told some people about it. They alerted her, and she went into hiding until Washington's nephew left, and she grew to a ripe old age. Her younger sister became the wedding present to Martha's granddaughter. And Elizabeth Custis's new husband later manumitted or freed the enslaved people they had gotten from Martha. Let's go to the next slide. George Washington died in 1799. And 5 months before his death, without actually knowing, of course, he was going to die in 5 months, he wrote his will. Interestingly, it was a month before he sent his nephew to try to kidnap Oney Judge. In the will, he stated that the enslaved people under his control would be freed upon Martha's death, with the exception of his valet, a man named William Lee, who would be freed at once. And the will is about 29 pages. He had a lot of property and a lot of things he wanted to say. The greatest amount of space in it, 3 full pages, are dedicated to slavery. Well, Washington died on December 14th, 1799. William Lee became free. Martha decided to free the enslaved people under her jurisdiction about a year later, and they became free at the beginning of 1801. Now, below her is a depiction of Gabriel Prosser, who tried to lead a rebellion in the Richmond area in 1800. It was found out, he and the others were executed. And it, you might say, snapped a lot of people to attention in the South and led to a lot of laws against teaching slaves, limiting slaves, etc. We see more of that later with Nat Turner. Now, whether this affected Martha, we don't know. We do know that it occurred to her that the people who would become free when she died might get the idea that if they hurried that process along, they might be free sooner. And she'd heard about a poisoning and thought, I don't want this. So she freed the enslaved people under her dower, the 84, or those who were left. She died about a year later. The others who were under the control of her grandchildren were another matter. To the right of Martha is a portrait of her son, whose name was John, who died at a very young age, and his grandson was named George Washington Parke Custis. He, in turn, retained those enslaved people. He had a daughter named Mary, whose picture is below him. And when she married the son of an old friend and eulogist of George Washington, a fellow Revolutionary War hero named Light Horse Harry Lee, who, when George Washington died, described him as first in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen. Light Horse Harry had a son named Robert Edward Lee, who inherited with Mary those enslaved people. And they were at a plantation that they called Arlington. And when the Civil War began and soldiers started dying, the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, chose to make that plantation a burial ground for Union war dead. And Robert E. Lee never got back that plantation, or as it turned out, the enslaved people. And by the way, during the war, Lincoln had a valet named William Johnson, a black man, who died. And Lincoln paid for his burial at Arlington, which by that time it was not so settled that it was military people alone. And on William Johnson's tombstone, he wrote the epitaph, "Citizen." Well, George Washington and slavery, it's complicated. So is most of history. I want to thank you for paying attention, as it were, and I'm glad to address any questions that have come up in the comment section, and I see one. So England ended slavery well before America. And the answer to that is yes. England ended slavery by the early 1830s. Now, remember that England had a lot of colonies and the process was more gradual. But by the early 1830s, England had eliminated slavery from its jurisdiction. In the case of the United States, the emancipation laws passed in the northern states during and after the Revolution, for example, Thomas Paine helped write Pennsylvania's emancipation law, they were just about all gradual. So that in fact, when the Civil War began, New Jersey still had a few slaves. Black people who were about 80 or so, who had been born before the legislation, and in turn were to remain enslaved, while those born after them would be free. So England was well ahead of the US, and just as a note, it's an issue during the Civil War, because on the one hand, England might support the Confederacy because of the need for cotton and the geopolitical possibilities of turning this young republic into two republics that would be weaker, but there was also a strong anti-slavery sentiment in England that supported the Union, especially after the Emancipation Proclamation. The question about modeling the structure, this has been a big debate among historians, whether the Iroquois Confederacy was the motivating factor. And it's possible both to understate and overstate this. I say overstate it because at one point, I think it was the state of New York, tried to require 9 weeks of study of the Iroquois Confederacy, just the Iroquois Confederacy, in the study of U.S. government. And that's a little much, to be fair about it. I don't think there is any doubt that the Founding Fathers were well read and were aware of this. And we tend to forget that the Constitution doesn't simply blossom out of James Madison one morning. He sits up at Mount Pelier, where he lived, and said, "We the people, in order to," etc. They had read a lot of different authors, studied a lot of different governments. So the Iroquois were part of the equation. So thanks for asking that, Deborah. I can see other questions over here, and I can address those too. One is, but the Revolutionary War was about freedom. Why didn't they just make everyone free at one time? And Dr. Samuel Johnson, the Englishman who wrote the first major dictionary, once said something about hearing the loudest yelps for freedom as coming from slave drivers. And his point was that the American colonists and new American people were, shall we say, just a little bit hypocritical. Well, they were. They were hypocrites. Many of us are, to be fair to them. And in terms of freedom itself being the motivation for the revolution, the answer is yes, but how do we define freedom? It's a contested concept. There's a book I would recommend in this regard called The Story of American Freedom. Came out about 20 years ago by a Pulitzer Prize-winning historian, Eric Foner, who also happened to be my graduate advisor, so he mentions me in the acknowledgments, all the more reason to hawk the book. But the whole idea that everyone has always agreed on freedom, or that freedom was the same thing throughout history, we know that's not true. And you can take this back to the Pilgrims and the Puritans, the Virginia colonists, but the Puritans came here for religious freedom, and that religious freedom included the right to kill people who did not subscribe to their religion. We don't recommend that today, obviously. The colonists, some of them were motivated by the desire for freedom, no question. I would say most of them. But again, how do they define it? It might be political freedom, the ability to elect your own officials or hold your own offices. It might be economic freedom. We don't want to be a colony. We don't have to respond to Great Britain if we're free of them. There might be aspects of religious freedom. There were fears about Catholicism. There was a considerable anti-Catholic sentiment in the colonies, and England had acquired Canada in the 7 Years' War, and Quebec was Catholic, and was that going to become an issue? So there are different desires for freedom. There's a desire in some cases for the freedom to do things, and in other cases for the freedom from certain things. It would be nice if it had been tidy. I agree completely. Sadly, it wasn't. And one of the things we see in this regard is the individual states having different positions on slavery. At the Constitutional Convention, South Carolina and Georgia threatened to pull out if they did not allow the slave trade to continue. And so the Constitution says that this traffic may continue for 20 years. Well, at the end of those 20 years, Congress immediately ends the international slave trade. There was still a domestic slave trade. There was still illegal activity in the sense of having international slave trading. But the concern was holding the country together. And as we saw, eventually, the country could not stay together with slavery. The house divided against itself could not stand. So I hope that helps.
Yeah, I want to stick with that question of the, you raised it as the American paradox, right? The fighting for freedom, at the same time profiting from the system of slavery.
Mhm.
So one of the questions that came up also during your presentation was just how linked was Washington's view of slavery to economics? And is it fair to say that his leanings were focused more on economics than a sense of equity?
I think yes. I think so. Uh, there is a theory, and I'm not saying I subscribe entirely to it, that slavery would have died out if not for the cotton gin. Because tobacco, as I said, exhausts the soil. And now what else are they going to plant? And I mentioned Washington with the economic issue with grains. The cotton gin comes along very late in Washington's life. But what the cotton gin did was remove the seeds from the cotton. Cotton's a plant. It has seeds, just as all plants do. And it was incredibly time-consuming to remove the seeds by hand. Now the gin can do it, and cotton becomes king, as Southerners would go on to say. I can envision Washington being around in, say, 1810, saying, I still don't like it, but I depend on it. We can't get rid of it. And it's kind of helpful if we don't think of Washington as he was something he was not, which is a great intellectual really sitting there brooding over these issues the way, say, Jefferson might, and look at him as kind of the center. And we can imagine other planters in his time saying, this is not making that much money. Maybe it's worth thinking about getting rid of. And then saying, oh, the cotton gin's making me money. I'm staying with it. We don't know offhand, I'm going to say, that, well, no, I think we can put it this way. Washington would not have been considered a believer in racial equality. Few Caucasians at the time were. At the same time, we see some things where he does actually appear to be thinking about matters, even from an economic standpoint, in a better way, from our perspective, than certain others who just were going to enslave, end of discussion, etc. So I do not want to make a hero of him on the issue of slavery, not at all. But I can look at the through line of history and say, John Calhoun, I have a lot more problems with things being named for John Calhoun than for George Washington. I hope that helps.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's go back to that idea of thinking of Washington as something he was not. Very early in your presentation, you referenced the cherry tree legend. And we know now, I remember, being in elementary school and being taught that story as though it was fact. And now we know that it was a story that was invented by one of his biographers, Mason Locke Weems, I think, as an attempt to make his story both more interesting and to posit him or to perfect his image as that perfect role model. So what lessons do we take from that sort of mythologizing of somebody like Washington and creating him as that sort of a figure?
Maybe don't trust me. And I don't quite mean it that way. But yeah, I mean, my mother once read a novel that, I've never found the line, but I remember it. History is the winner's way of justifying his actions and the loser's way of getting even. Well, there's some truth to that. There was a view of history, and this is certainly what Parson Mason Weems believed, that you tell it in such a way as to give us role models to teach morality. Well, that's a debate today. What is the role of education in morals? Should that be something we get at home, church, wherever else? And is it our job to teach the facts? And a lot of the facts of history are clear, but a lot are also unclear. You know, we cannot get in Washington's head, except for what letters he wrote, and we can use what you might call the hearsay evidence of Jefferson saying, oh, I was talking with Washington today and he said such and such. But we tend to create these figures partly to have something to aim for. The term that's was popular in my line of work is a usable past. Well, we can see the change of that with just the example I like to give students about how things have changed for the better. You may recall about 4 years ago during Black History Month, Donald Trump spoke about Frederick Douglass as if he was still alive. And in my classes, I pointed out, set aside the politics. Donald Trump grew up in a time, because I grew up 20 years or so later in a similar time, where when we did what we did not then call Black History Month, it was called Negro History Month, what did we hear? George Washington Carver and the peanut. That was essentially all we heard about. Now, I can be critical of Donald Trump for not having read a book, but the education he was getting, which we know to have been a well-financed education, did not focus on that part of our past. And we end up in these debates and going back and forth about, well, should we name something for something? Who should it be named for? And when we name something or build a monument or a site, we might be trying to get people to admire that person, but we also might have a political point we're trying to make. And I'll just say, like, the statues of Robert E. Lee were not erected right after the Civil War. They were erected either in, say, the 1890s or even in the civil rights era of the 50s and 60s, and they were designed to promote white supremacy. I don't know that we would say that the mythologizing of Washington was designed to promote white supremacy so much as promote this moralistic vision of our country that we have not always lived up to.
Right. So I think that brings us to a good final question, which was shared by someone in the audience, actually. And it was just the question of why then is all of this important for us to know now? We see this kind of conflicting story of George Washington's image through the mythologization of him, through conflicting perspectives on slavery and the rights of different types of people. So why is it important for us to know this information?
You know, you can assign this a broader answer and say, it's too simple to say, oh, those who do not learn from the past are condemned to repeat it, because we do repeat it even when we've learned it. But I do think it's vital to understanding ourselves. And I made a comment about a through line. Well, if you look at Washington and slavery, and then you look at the debate at the time, you better understand both the issue and the people involved in it. And this can help us understand today if we say, why doesn't Joe Biden do such and such? And, for example, the making of the myth of George Washington. There's a documentary, apparently, running about now about Britney Spears. Now, please do not think I am comparing George Washington and Britney Spears, although, as I said, George liked to dance. But if you think about it, images. We do create images of people. And I think if we understand that evolution, or sometimes de-evolution, I think we do also get a better understanding of ourselves. And that comes from studying the myths and the realities.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Green, for coming to the end of our hour. We want to thank all of those who joined us today and participated and asked questions and learned with us today on this topic. As you all know, we have several of these sessions planned throughout the remainder of the month, going into next month, actually through June. I believe at this point we have sessions already planned out for you, and we're excited to continue these conversations as we explore the narrative of Black life in America, the history of America and its founding. Tomorrow we will have a session for you called Black History is America's History. And I think that is very much the narrative and the story of what these sessions are really all about, is framing this story as history that's shared by all of us and important for all of us to understand and gain this sort of context of. So we look forward to seeing you back with us tomorrow evening. We look forward to seeing you all with us throughout the remainder of the month and in the upcoming months. And we encourage you to continue learning, seeking this information, studying history through a critical lens, and trying to get to the root of what all of these stories are really all about. And with that, we say thank you. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Enjoy the 2 holidays that we have back to back, and we will see you next time.